The sound grew heavier, no longer distant, no longer ignorable, a deep, rhythmic thump that pressed against the air like a heartbeat too large for the sky. And one by one the recruits began to notice, their laughter thinning, their attention drifting upward as a shadow moved across the training yard, long and deliberate, cutting the sunlight in a slow sweep that made the concrete seem colder than it had a moment ago. And Petty Officer Ryan Cole felt it first in his chest, that quiet tightening. That came when something was about to go very wrong, or very right. He could not tell which yet, but he knew enough to step forward again, placing himself between Briggs and the old man without making it obvious. His voice lower now, sharper. "Briggs, step back," he said, not loud, not aggressive, but carrying something that did not invite argument. And this time Briggs hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, because something in Cole's tone did not match the joke anymore. It did not match the easy confidence of a training yard where everything was controlled and predictable. This felt different, like a line had been crossed that nobody had seen until it was too late. But pride is a stubborn thing, especially in someone who has not yet been corrected by experience. And Briggs let out a short laugh, forcing it, trying to pull the moment back into something familiar. "What? You know this guy now," he said, glancing around for support that did not come as quickly as before, because the others were watching the sky now, watching the dark shape descending, watching the dust begin to stir in slow circles along the edges of the field. And the old man still had not moved. Not really, just standing there with that same quiet posture, his gaze no longer distant but present, focused, as if he had been expecting this all along. And Cole's eyes flicked back to the tattoo, tracing the lines again, the imperfect circle, the faint star at its center, the way the ink had bled over time, but still held its shape. And something clicked into place in his memory, something half buried from a briefing he was not supposed to remember in detail, a slide that had appeared for less than 10 seconds before being pulled, marked restricted, unacknowledged, a symbol tied to operations that officially did not exist. And his throat went dry as he realized what that meant, not just about the mark, but about the man wearing it. And above them the helicopter dropped lower, the rotor wash now loud enough to drown out conversation completely, wind tearing across uniforms, snapping loose fabric, forcing everyone to brace their stance. And still the old man did not react, did not shield his eyes, did not turn away. He simply stood there, steady as if the noise and force were nothing more than a passing breeze. And that, more than anything, made the tension tighten across the group, because it was not normal. It was not how anyone else was standing, and Briggs felt it now too, even if he did not understand it. The creeping sense that the situation had slipped beyond him, that whatever control he thought he had a minute ago was gone, replaced by something larger, something he could not name. And as the helicopter settled onto the edge of the field with a heavy final thud, the engine still roaring, the side door slid open, and a figure stepped down into the dust, straight-backed, deliberate, moving with the kind of certainty that did not need to announce itself. And Cole did not need to see the insignia to know exactly who it was, his breath catching as he straightened instinctively, the realization hitting fully now, too late to undo anything that had already happened, because the man walking toward them was not here by coincidence, and he was not here for the recruits. The rotor wash clawed at the ground, lifting dust and grit into spiraling sheets that blurred the edges of everything. But the man stepping out of the helicopter moved through it like it was not even there, his boots striking the concrete with a measured rhythm that cut through the noise more clearly than any shouted command ever could. And one by one the recruits straightened without being told, their bodies reacting before their minds could catch up, because presence like that did not need explanation, it demanded alignment. And Petty Officer Ryan Cole snapped to attention fully now, his spine locking, his gaze forward, every instinct screaming that whatever was about to happen was far above anything this training yard was meant to handle. And still the old man remained exactly where he was, unmoved, unshaken, as the distance between them closed, 10 yards, then 5, then 2, until the commander stopped directly in front of him, close enough that the dust settled around their boots in a slow drifting circle. And for a moment, just a moment, everything went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the helicopter, because even the noise seemed to pull back, as if the space between these two men carried its own gravity. And the commander's eyes dropped, Not to the face, not to the stance, but to the tattoo, studying it with a precision that was almost surgical, tracing every faded line, every imperfection, every year it had survived. And something shifted in his expression, subtle but undeniable. The kind of shift that only someone trained to read people would ever notice. Recognition. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition, followed by something heavier, something closer to respect. And behind him the recruits felt it without understanding it. The weight of a moment they had accidentally stepped into. And Briggs, who had been so certain just minutes ago, felt his confidence draining out in silence, replaced by a tight unease that settled in his chest and would not move. Because nothing about this matched the story he had been telling himself. Not the helicopter, not the commander, not the way every senior enlisted within sight had gone completely still, and the old man finally moved, not stepping back, not turning away, just lifting his gaze to meet the commander's eyes, calm, steady, like he had done this before, like he had stood in front of power and watched it decide what came next. And for a fraction of a second it was not a commander and a civilian facing each other. It was something older, something forged in places that did not exist on maps. And then the commander drew in a slow breath, straightened, and brought his hand up in a clean, precise motion, the salute snapping into place with absolute clarity, sharp enough to cut through every lingering doubt in the air, and it landed like a shockwave, because it was not casual, it was not symbolic, it was exact, deliberate, the kind of salute reserved for someone whose record did not need to be spoken aloud. And no one moved. No one spoke. Not even the wind seemed to push as hard anymore. And the commander held it for a full second before lowering his hand, his voice calm but carrying across the entire yard without effort. "Sir," he said, and that single word did more than any explanation ever could, because in that moment every assumption that had been made, every joke, every laugh, every careless touch, collapsed under the weight of something none of them had seen coming. And Briggs felt it fully now, the realization settling in with a quiet finality that left no room to escape it, because whatever that mark meant, whatever that man had been, it was enough to make a commander arrive without warning and render a salute without hesitation, and that was not something you could take back once it had been given. No one spoke for several seconds after the salute ended, not because they were ordered to be silent, but because something far heavier than authority had settled over the training yard, something that pressed against the chest and slowed the breath. And the commander did not look at the recruits, did not acknowledge the formation. His attention remained fixed on the old man, as if the rest of the world had temporarily ceased to exist. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower now, controlled, carrying a weight that did not need volume. "I was not sure you would ever come back here," he said, each word deliberate, chosen, and the old man's expression did not change, but there was a faint shift in his eyes, something that might have been recognition or memory or both. And for a moment it felt as though an entire conversation passed between them without a single additional word, a shared history that did not require explanation. And behind them the recruits stood frozen, their earlier confidence replaced by a rigid stillness that came from realizing they were no longer the center of the situation, that they had become witnesses to something they did not understand. And Briggs swallowed hard, the dry taste of dust lingering in his mouth as he replayed the last few minutes in his head, every word he had said now sounding different, sharper, heavier, and impossible to take back. And Petty Officer Ryan Cole kept his eyes forward, but his mind was racing, connecting pieces faster now, the restricted briefings, the erased files, the symbol that was never meant to be recognized in open daylight. And he felt a quiet certainty settle in that the man standing a few feet away was not just a veteran, not just a survivor, but something far rarer, someone who had operated in the spaces between official history and lived reality. And the commander finally turned, just slightly, enough to let his gaze pass over the recruits for the first time. And it was not anger in his eyes, not even disappointment. It was something colder, something more precise, the look of someone measuring consequences. And when his eyes stopped on Briggs, the effect was immediate, the young recruit straightening instinctively, his shoulders locking as if held in place by something invisible. And the commander took one step closer, closing the distance without urgency, without threat, just certainty. "You placed your hand on that mark," he said, his tone even, almost conversational, but every word landed with unmistakable clarity. Do you know what it represents? And Briggs opened his mouth, but nothing came out, because for the first time since the encounter, he did not have an answer ready, did not have a joke, did not have anything at all, and the silence stretched just long enough to make the lesson settle in before the commander continued. No, you do not, he said quietly, and then he shifted his attention back to the old man, his posture straightening once more, respect returning to the forefront. Sir, permission to escort you, he added, and there was no trace of ceremony in the request, only sincerity, and the old man studied him for a moment, the same calm, measured gaze he had carried since the beginning, and then he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough, and as the commander stepped aside to allow him to move forward, the space opened naturally, the recruits parting without being told, creating a path they had not realized they would be asked to make. And as the old man walked past them, his pace remained steady, unhurried, but every step carried a presence that none of them would forget. And Briggs felt it most of all as the distance between them grew, a quiet realization settling in deeper than any shouted correction ever could, because no one had raised their voice, no one had punished him, and yet the weight of what had just happened would stay with him far longer than any formal reprimand. And behind them the helicopter idled, waiting, as if it too understood that some departures did not require explanation, only silence. The path remained open long after he had passed, as if no one was willing to be the first to close it, and the sound of his boots against the concrete faded into the steady hum of the helicopter waiting at the edge of the field, its rotors still cutting the air in slow, powerful rotations that matched the rhythm of something far older than the moment itself. And Commander Nathan Cross walked half a step behind him, not leading, not directing, but accompanying, a subtle difference that did not go unnoticed by anyone watching closely enough, and Petty Officer Ryan Cole noticed it clearly, the shift in dynamic that said more than any rank insignia ever could, because men like Cross did not walk behind many people, and yet here he was, measured, respectful, as if the space between them carried rules that the rest of the base did not even know existed. And the old man stopped just short of the helicopter, his gaze lifting briefly toward the spinning blades, not with awe, not with curiosity, but with recognition, like someone looking at a tool he had used long ago and no longer needed to understand. And for a moment the commander said nothing, allowing the silence to hold, before speaking again, quieter now, almost lost beneath the engine noise, but still perfectly clear to the man beside him. They never cleared your file, he said, not as a question, but as a statement shaped by years of knowing how certain things were handled, and the old man gave the faintest exhale, something that might have been a dry laugh if it had been louder. They were not supposed to. He replied, his voice steady, unchanged by time, and Cross nodded once, as if that confirmed everything he needed, his eyes drifting briefly back toward the training yard where the recruits still stood frozen in place, their formation broken not by command, but by realization, and Briggs remained where he was, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the ground in front of him as if trying to piece together something that no longer made sense. And Cole finally allowed himself a slight shift in stance, just enough to breathe again, though the weight of what he had witnessed was not leaving anytime soon, because it was not just the salute, not just the arrival. It was the quiet acknowledgement between two men who had clearly shared something that had never been written down. And Cross turned back, his voice carrying just enough now to reach beyond the immediate space. You will not find that mark in any manual, he said, not addressing a specific person, but ensuring the words were heard. And you will not hear it spoken in any briefing. And he paused, letting the implication settle fully before continuing. But there are operations this country will never confirm, and men it will never officially remember. And his gaze sharpened slightly as it passed over the group, landing once more on Briggs for a brief, measured second. That does not make them less real. He finished, and the statement hung there, heavier than any reprimand, because it carried truth instead of correction, and the old man did not react to the explanation, did not need it, his attention already moving forward as he reached the open side door of the helicopter, placing one hand against the frame with a familiarity that spoke of years no one here had seen, and he paused just once before stepping inside. turning his head slightly, not enough to face the group, but enough to let his voice carry back without effort. "You wear the uniform long enough," he said calmly. "You learn the difference between what is seen and what is earned." And then he stepped in, disappearing into the shadowed interior. And for a moment longer the commander remained where he was, eyes on the open door, as if acknowledging something unspoken, before turning sharply, his posture returning to command as he signaled the crew, and the helicopter began to lift, slowly at first, then with gathering force. The wind sweeping across the field once more, scattering dust, flattening fabric, and as it rose above them, carrying the old man away without ceremony, without announcement, the silence left behind felt even louder than the noise had been, and Briggs finally lifted his head, his expression no longer confident, no longer certain, but changed in a way that would not fade quickly, because some lessons were not taught through orders. They were lived in a single moment that could not be undone, and this had been one of them. The helicopter became a distant shape against the bright sky, its sound fading into a low echo that lingered longer than it should have, as if the air itself was reluctant to let the moment go. And the training yard remained still, not by command, not by structure, but by something far deeper, a collective pause that none of the recruits had been trained for, because there was no manual for what had just happened, no protocol for understanding it, and Petty Officer Ryan Cole was the first to move. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a small shift of weight as he exhaled slowly, his eyes still fixed on the empty space where the helicopter had been moments before, replaying every detail in his mind with the precision of someone who knew that what he had seen was not supposed to be visible, not in the open, not in front of a formation of recruits. And he turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at Briggs, who had not moved at all, his posture locked, his expression caught, somewhere between confusion and realization, like a man trying to reconcile two versions of reality that did not fit together. And Cole stepped closer, lowering his voice, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for the silence that still hung in the air. "You felt that, did you not?" he said, not accusing, not correcting, just stating something that did not need denial. And Briggs swallowed, his throat dry, his voice slower now, stripped of its earlier confidence. I do not even know what just happened," he admitted, and that honesty, rare and unguarded, hung heavier than any excuse could have. And Cole gave a small nod, his gaze drifting back toward the horizon. "That is the point," he said quietly. "Some things you are not meant to understand right away." And the recruits nearby began to shift, not speaking, but adjusting, their formations slowly reforming out of habit rather than instruction, because structure was the only thing they had left to hold onto. And Briggs finally lifted his eyes, looking out across the field as if expecting something else to appear, some explanation, some correction, but there was nothing. Just heat rising off the concrete, just the distant outline of buildings that now felt smaller than they had before, and he glanced down at his own hands, the same hands that had reached out without hesitation minutes ago. And for the first time he noticed the weight of that action, not physical, but something deeper, something that settled into memory in a way that could not be ignored. And Cole watched him for a moment before speaking again, his tone measured, deliberate. "There are men who wear the uniform," he said. "And there are men who carry what it stands for long after they take it off." And he paused, letting the distinction settle fully before continuing. "You just met one of the second kind." And Briggs nodded slowly, not fully understanding, but no longer resisting the idea. And across the yard, a senior instructor finally stepped forward, his presence reasserting structure, his voice firm but lacking its usual edge. "Back to formation," he called out, and the recruits responded immediately, snapping into position with renewed precision, not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect. And as the line straightened and the routine resumed, there was a subtle difference in the way they stood, in the way they held their gaze, in the way they listened, because something had shifted, something that would not be undone by the return to normal. And Briggs took his place among them, his posture aligned, his focus forward, but his mind still anchored to that single moment, the salute, the silence, the realization that there were stories written into the world that no rank, no training, no assumption could fully prepare you for. And as the instructor began to speak again, his words blending back into the familiar rhythm of drills and expectations. Briggs found himself listening differently, not just to the commands, but to what lay beneath them, the unspoken weight of experience, the quiet understanding that respect was not something you demanded. It was something you learned to recognize, often too late, but never without consequence. The rest of the day moved forward exactly as it was supposed to, drills called out, boots striking pavement in perfect rhythm, voices responding in sharp unison. But something underneath it all had changed, something subtle but permanent, like a shift in the ground that no one could see, but everyone could feel. And Private Logan Briggs felt it the most, because every command he followed now carried an echo of that moment. Every step measured against a standard he had not known existed just hours earlier. And when the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the training yard, the formation was finally dismissed, the tension releasing in quiet waves as recruits broke apart, some talking in low voices, others choosing silence, and Briggs did not join either group. He remained where he was for a moment longer, staring at the empty stretch of concrete where the old man had stood, as if expecting some trace of him to still be there, something to confirm that it had all been real. And when nothing appeared, he let out a slow breath and turned, heading toward the barracks with a pace that lacked its usual edge, and behind him Petty Officer Ryan Cole watched for a second before following, not out of obligation, but because he recognized that look, the one that came after something had unsettled more than just a moment. And inside the barracks the noise returned in fragments, lockers opening, gears shifting, low conversations building, but it never reached its usual volume, never quite shook off the weight of what had happened, and Briggs moved to his bunk, sitting down heavily, his hands resting on his knees as he stared ahead, replaying the sequence again, the laughter, the touch, the silence, the salute, each piece now carrying a different meaning than it had in the moment. And Cole stepped into the space across from him, leaning lightly against the metal frame of a bunk, arms crossed, not imposing, not lecturing, just present, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching naturally before Briggs finally broke it, his voice low, uncertain. "That symbol. You knew it, did not you?" And Cole nodded once, slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I have seen it before," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But only once, and only for a few seconds." And Briggs looked up, something sharper in his gaze now, not arrogance, but curiosity edged with respect. "What is it?" he asked, and Cole exhaled softly, glancing toward the door, as if confirming that no one else was close enough to hear, not out of fear, but out of habit. "It is not something you will find in any official record," he said, his voice steady. "It belongs to a unit that was never meant to exist on paper." And Briggs frowned slightly, leaning forward, trying to piece it together. "Then how do you know it is real?" He pressed, and Cole's eyes met his, holding for a second longer this time. "Because people who should not react, he answered. And that settled into Briggs in a way that no detailed explanation ever could, because it matched exactly what he had seen, the commander's arrival, the immediate recognition, the unquestioned respect, and he leaned back slowly, absorbing it, letting the realization take its place, and after a moment he spoke again, quieter now. "I should not have touched it." And Cole did not respond right away, letting the statement stand on its own, because it did not need correction, it was already understood. And finally he gave a small nod. "No," he said simply, "you should not have." And there was no judgment in his tone, no edge, just confirmation, and Briggs lowered his gaze again, not in shame, but in thought, the kind that reshapes how a person sees the world. And outside the barracks, the last light of the day stretched across the base, long and quiet, settling over buildings, over empty training grounds, over a place that looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but no longer felt that way to the ones who had been there to see the difference. Sleep did not come easily that night, not for Logan Briggs, and not for a few others who had been close enough to see everything clearly, because the mind has a way of replaying moments it does not yet understand, slowing them down, turning them over piece by piece, searching for meaning in the spaces between what was said and what was not. And Briggs lay on his bunk staring at the dark ceiling, the faint hum of the bass settling into the background as his thoughts kept circling back to the same image, the commander's hand rising in that precise, deliberate motion, the kind of salute that could not be faked or forced, and the way the old man had received it without surprise, without hesitation, as if it had happened before, many times, in places no one here would ever see. And sometime after midnight he sat up quietly, careful not to wake the others, and reached for his phone, not to break rules, but because the question would not leave him alone, and he began to search, slowly at first, vague terms, then more specific ones, trying to describe what he had seen without knowing how to name it. But every path ended the same way. Nothing official, nothing clear, just fragments, mentions of operations that had no details, units that had no records, symbols that were described but never shown, and that only made the silence around it feel louder. Because absence can speak just as clearly as presence when you know what you are looking for. And after a while he lowered the phone, exhaling softly, realizing that whatever answers existed were not meant to be found this way, not by someone outside that world. And across the room Ryan Cole was still awake as well, sitting on the edge of his bunk, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, and without looking over he spoke, his voice low. "You are not going to find it online." And Briggs let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I figured that," he admitted, running a hand through his hair as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "It just does not make sense." And Cole finally turned his head, studying him for a moment before answering. "It is not supposed to," he said, and there was no mystery in his tone, just clarity. "Some things only make sense to the people who were there." And Briggs nodded slowly, absorbing that, though it did not fully settle the weight he felt, because understanding was not the same as experiencing, and that gap was what stayed with him. And after a few seconds he spoke again, quieter now. He said something before he left, and Cole waited, letting him finish, about the difference between what is seen and what is earned. Briggs continued, his voice thoughtful. "I did not get it then." And Cole gave a small nod, his gaze steady. "You do now," he replied. And it was not a question. And Briggs sat back, letting the silence return, but it felt different this time. Less uncertain, more grounded, as if the edges of the moment had begun to settle into something he could carry forward. And outside the barracks the night stretched wide and quiet over the base, lights glowing softly along the distant structures, the training yard now empty, the same ground where everything had shifted earlier in the day, and somewhere far beyond that, beyond the reach of routine and structure, a helicopter moved through the darkness carrying a man who would not appear in any report, whose name would not be called in any formation, and yet whose presence had left a mark stronger than any official recognition could provide. And back inside, Briggs finally lay down again, his eyes closing slowly, not because the questions were gone, but because he no longer needed all the answers to understand the lesson. And as sleep finally began to take hold, one thought remained clearer than the rest, not loud, not dramatic, just steady and certain, that respect was not something you gave based on what you saw in front of you, but on what might be hidden beneath it, waiting for the moment when it no longer needed to be proven. Morning came early, as it always did on base, the sharp call of routine cutting through the last traces of sleep, boots hitting the floor, lockers opening, voices steady and controlled. But for Logan Briggs the world felt slightly different, not in a way anyone else could see, not in a way that changed the schedule or the structure, but in the way he carried himself as he stepped back onto the training yard, his posture aligned, his gaze forward, and yet more aware than it had been the day before, because now he was looking beyond what was obvious, beyond rank, beyond uniform, searching for something deeper in the way people moved, the way they stood, the way they held silence. And as the formation settled into place under the rising sun, the concrete warming beneath their boots, he caught himself glancing once, just once, toward the far edge of the field where the helicopter had landed, where the moment had shifted everything without warning, and there was nothing there now. No mark, no sign, just empty space, and yet it felt full, like something unseen still lingered, not physically, but in memory. And Petty Officer Ryan Cole stepped into position nearby, his presence steady, unchanged, but when his eyes briefly met Briggs there was a small acknowledgement there, not spoken, not formal, just a quiet understanding that did not need to be explained, and the instructor's voice cut through the air, calling the next drill sharp and precise. And the recruits responded instantly, their movements clean, synchronized. But there was a subtle difference in the rhythm, a fraction more focus, a fraction more intent, as if each command now carried a weight that had not been there before, and Briggs moved with them, step for step. But his mind was no longer racing, no longer trying to solve something it could not reach. Instead, it had settled into something simpler, something clearer, and as the drill ended and the formation held, waiting for the next command, a brief pause opened, and in that silence Briggs felt the lesson fully for the first time, not as confusion, not as shock, but as something steady and lasting, the understanding that respect was not tied to appearances, not guaranteed by rank, not proven by what could be seen on the surface, but earned in ways that often remained hidden, carried quietly by those who had lived it, and never demanded from those who had not. And his shoulders straightened just slightly, not out of tension, but out of alignment with that realization. And when the next command came, he answered with a voice that was no longer driven by the need to prove anything, but by the understanding that there was more to this path than he had seen before. And across the yard the day continued exactly as it always did, structured, disciplined, predictable, and yet beneath it all something had changed, something that would not show up in reports or evaluations, something that would not be measured or recorded, but would stay with him long after this place, long after the uniform, long after the moment itself had passed. And as the sun climbed higher, casting sharp light across the formation, one thought settled quietly in his mind, clear and unshaken, that some people do not need to explain who they are, because the right ones will already know, and the rest will learn when it matters most.